The gospel text for today is preached on pretty often, so I thought I would do Paul's letter to the Philippians. But first, can you tell me who wrote this song? See if you recognize this. Here come old flat top, he come, grooving up slowly, he got juju eyeballs, he's one holy roller, he's got hair down to his knee, got to be a joker, he just do what he please, yeah. Okay, who wrote that?
Lennon.
The Beatles, yes. More specifically?
Lennon.
Lennon McCartney, okay. John Lennon wrote that song, and you're right, it is accredited to Lennon McCartney. How about this one? Blackbird singing in the dead of night, take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. Who wrote that one? Paul McCartney. Now you're catching on, see? How about Yesterday? Paul McCartney. All right. How about Michel, ma belle, sont les mots qui vont très bien ensemble? Paul McCartney. I just did that one because I wanted to show you the extent of my French. Here's one that they did write together. Paul McCartney writes, and they were sitting at the piano, as the story goes, I admit it's getting better all the time. That's McCartney. And then Lennon says, it couldn't get much worse. I admit it's getting better. And together, Lennon and McCartney shared the songwriting credits. It may be that one person wrote all of the song, like Come Together in John Lennon's case, but they decided early on that it was not so much about who got credit, it was about the song. The song, in order for the song to be the best it could be, they didn't want to worry about whose 3% or 5% or 15% of the song it was. The song was the most important thing. Going from Sir Paul to St. Paul writes to the church in Philippi about these inner struggles that are going on there. The Philippians had done a great job, actually, of holding off outside pressures, and they had developed their early church model quite well, but then they started, as churches can do, have this inner struggle. And so we don't have the letter that goes to Paul, but we do have Paul's responses in this letter to the Philippians. And basically, he's asking them to be of one mind. He's asking them to let go, to be humble. And he gives an example of Christ, who was humiliated, was a proper translation, as a slave. Not even death on the cross, but a cross. Nameless. But God's economy is such that turns that into exalting Christ. And Paul lifts this up as an example. As Christians, those who follow Christ and have a Christ-like life as much as we can, that we are to be humble and we are to let humility be a Christian virtue that surrenders the self. I'm not saying be a doormat or anything, but surrenders the self because the song is more important. Jesus emptied himself, as this Philippians hymn and verses 6 through 11 talk about. Paul says Jesus emptied himself. He made a sacrifice of the self to make room for God to work in his life. It's good for us to remember that the song is king. Jesus is that song. Jesus is king. So whatever it takes for us to come together and to operate in one mind helps lift up the song. One thing that I would invite for you to consider doing beginning today and for the next few days is to start your day with a sense of humility. And if you want to write this sentence down, then I invite you to do so if this is helpful to you. It's a simple sentence, or a question. It's, Lord, what is it that you would have me be about today? Lord, what is it that you would have me be about today? Be about today. And then right with that, Lord, what is it that you would have me do today? Be and do. And if we can start our day with that question, and again, I invite you to have those questions at the beginning of your day, then it can offer us the opportunity to be in this humble place, because we are acknowledging that we are not Lord of our lives. We are acknowledging that Jesus is Lord of our lives. And we're stating that from the get-go. And if there's any creed, if you will, of the Bible, of the New Testament, it's 3 words: Jesus is Lord. And what we do with that makes all the difference. So humility allows us to make room for God in our life. So why not start with that at the beginning? Some of you remember retired news anchor Tom Brokaw. Tom Brokaw came from the Midwest and worked his way up, and one day he's doing the national news in New York, and he writes that he was shopping at Bloomingdale's in Manhattan when somebody walked up to him, a man walked up to him and said, Tom Brokaw, right? Omaha, KMTV, right? And Tom Brokaw said, yes, that's right. And the guy goes, I knew it. Whatever happened to you? And Tom Brokaw said he never forgot the power of being humble. And, you know, the gratitude that comes with that, right? Of the journey. Whatever happened to you? Or one of my favorites, the one who called himself the greatest boxer of all time, Muhammad Ali, gets on a plane, the story goes, and the flight attendant, as they're preparing for takeoff, says to him, Mr. Ali, you need to put your seatbelt on, please. And Muhammad Ali's response was, Superman doesn't need a seatbelt. And she replied, as she leaned over, Superman doesn't need a plane either. Humility is the beginning of wisdom, as they say. And I think it's because it makes space. Humility makes space for wisdom to grow. It's not going to dwell in us if we don't make space for it to dwell, right? It means that we always have something to learn from someone else, from the group, and perhaps especially from those that we seem to have conflict with. If we lean into that and we trust God to deliver out of that moment or out of that exchange, out of that relationship, what is good for the kingdom, then we are sure to have something come out of it that is indeed positive. In today's world, we have this term we call cancel culture. It's when someone is ghosted. It's when there is no room for that person, and so they are just, communication stops and they are cut off. But, you know, really what that says, if that person is a Christian, is that there's no room for God in their heart. And so as Christians, as we make room for God in our heart, we are not allowed to cancel. We are not allowed to cancel anyone. Humility keeps us at the table. It keeps us in the conversation. And to have that humility, then we also need to recognize the gift of being vulnerable. Vulnerability, and one image I have is an open hand. An open hand, when we shake hands, you know, comes from saying we have no weapons. I'm not hiding anything if I'm shaking hands with you. Or if we wave to someone, I have nothing that I'm going to pull out to hurt you with. In the book, the classic book, The Sacred Table, a book I love by Nora Gallagher, she writes about coming to communion with an open hand. Whether you stand or kneel, the posture of our heart is one of respect, gratitude, and humility. We all kneel when we take communion, no matter what our bodily stance may be at the time. Our hearts kneel, our minds kneel, our wills kneel to God. We open our hand and we receive communion. We receive Jesus. And when we are open to receiving Jesus, we are also saying that we find value in being of one mind, because we are receiving communion with one another in this space, in this worship, and with other Christians in Lexington, in Kentucky, and around the world. We are in communion with Christ, and Christ gathers us to be in communion and of one mind with each other. If you're able sometime, even if you receive communion at the lower station, to take a look at the rear DOS today or after the service or sometime, notice the center figure of Jesus at the Lord's Supper at the table. When he's saying, this is the bread, and his right hand is on the bread, and his left hand is open with a chalice or a cup there. And he's saying, this is the bread, remember me in the taking of this bread and this wine. We can think about that openness as being willing to be humble with one another and to be willing to receive what God would have us receive. Lord, what is it that you would have me be about today? What is it that you would have me do today? Being Christian is our shared songwriting credit with God. It's when we say the song is king, and that's the most important thing. And finally, Paul brings out a hymn in this Philippians passage and sings a song in his own message here. He's reminding them in verses 6 through 11 of this song that would have brought to them the perspective that Jesus is Lord. And then he ends with this beautiful prayer. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, meaning respect. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for God's good pleasure. Sometimes we think it's up to us to muster the will to let God in. But God has given us that will by the grace and love of God and of Jesus Christ, has given us the power to have that will, to put a crack in the day, to open up and say, God, what would you have me be about today as your servant? God gives us the will and God gives us the work. And it's all for purposes of salvation and restoration of all creation. And that's the gift that we have when we are open to receiving Jesus. And that is the gift that we have when we are indeed one mind, singing the same song. Thanks be to God. Amen.